On today's Locked On Jayhawks, too early projection of the starting five and minutes rotation for Kansas Jayhawks basketball in 2024-25.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can give me a follow on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio. You can find our show, Locked On Jayhawks, anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page, where you can like and subscribe to the show. And on today's edition of LOJ, we're talking Kansas basketball, too early projections for the starting lineup, the minute allocation, and where the biggest competitions are going to come in on as we finish up the offseason here and then head into the start of the school year before they get going with, exhibition games coming in late October. First, this episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply with Game Time. All right, so we're going to start with this, the starting five projection, starting lineup projection. Then we'll get into our minutes projection for everything as part of the rotation and where some of the biggest changes could possibly come as part of this. So I guess just ripping the Band-Aid off, my starting lineup projection, Dajuan Harris at the point guard. Shocking there, right? Hunter Dickinson at the five. Those seem like the two kind of locks as a part of all of this. I guess I would throw AJ Storr in as a lock as well. I mean, he was second team All Big Ten a season ago. If he would have been back at Wisconsin this year, he's preseason All Big Ten first team. Like, he might be preseason All Big 12 first team this year. If not, he certainly is in that conversation. And I think those guys are pretty much locks to be in the starting lineup. I think if Kansas would have gone out and added another player like a Jackson Robinson, who they were, at least, kicking the can on a little bit, or one of these other like big players, then maybe it would be more of a conversation. But the other two guys like Rylan Griffen and KJ Adams feel like, they're probably going to start. If you're in the camp of, hey, Bill Self doesn't like relinquish guys from being starters from the year before, then KJ Adams would be a lock for you. Maybe you would even, if you're on the opposite side of that you just think they're completely overhauling things, you would be open to the idea of Dajuan starting with Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson, and then Zeke Mayo or Shakeel Moore or something like that as the fifth guy. And that is entirely possible, but I'm going to lean to the side of Bill Self trusting the veteran and the guy that he knows how to do. And I will say, as much as it can be a little bit of a concern, and it certainly will be questioned coming into the season, how well Kansas can play with the two bigs, with KJ next to Hunter, with KJ not being a shooter. The offense worked a lot better when Hunter Dickinson was hitting threes at the beginning of the season. You don't expect him to hit 50 to 60%, which is what he was hitting at the beginning of last year. But like, he went from being 50 to 60% to being like, it was like a 2 of 30 stretch or something like that. If he can just level out and be the good shooter, the above average, whatever it is for the rest of the way, like that consistency will help. Plus you have better shooters all around, more consistent shooters on the court. Besides that, I think they'll be able to make it work, but maybe it does come with a little less minutes. And maybe though, this is a conversation of the starting five at the beginning of the season will be different than the starting five come January or February, right? Like maybe the conversation of the starting five now is KJ Adams, and you tip him that nod as the veteran to have his starting spot at the beginning of the year. But you're going to throw out lineups, even if your starting five is that lineup. There's going to be certain lineups during the game where you do play, an AJ Storr at the 4 with Rylan Griffen at the 3 and Shakeel Moore, Zeke Mayo at the 2, or Rakease Passmore at the 2/3 and Griffen at the other one and Storr at the 4, right? And if those lineups, one of those lineups ends up just being by far your best lineup, and like it's pretty apparent to the coaching staff and the players and everything, like eventually there will hit a period, could be late January, could be February, I don't know, could be March, where they will just say, okay, we're going to go this direction with maybe our starting five, or this direction more often during the game. Now, then again, the starting lineup is more of a nod. Like, you could start someone and they could play 15 minutes per game. It's more about who finishes the game and plays those more minutes. And that is the more important thing. But yeah, Dajuan Harris, Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson. To me, that feels like a very strong possibility. That is the starting lineup. Like I said, that would have more had a wrench in it had they brought in kind of another big player into all this, to where the question would have come. I do think the biggest question, though, does come down to how do you want to play ideally, and what's going to be the best style of play. And like I said, even if you are starting this lineup, where does your best play come? Does it come with KJ and Hunter playing next to each other? Does it come with AJ Storr at the 4 or something like that, right? Like, where do the most minutes come from, even if the starting lineup is one way or another. And so I think, though, with Dajuan, Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson, like, if I were to look at who has the best chance of, if that situation did happen, like I said, where all of a sudden you get to January or February and you're talking about a different starting five and Bill Self shakes things up a little bit, I think the most likely situation would be just that. It would be that you've decided, hey, this two big basketball thing doesn't work as well. We're going to have KJ coming off the bench. We're going to start Storr at the 4. And then I think it would be probably either Shakeel Moore or Zeke Mayo who would be that other starter for you. Probably cases for both guys. I mean, with Zeke Mayo, the better shooter. And if you're taking KJ Adams off the floor, to be a starter later in the season for the idea of having more shooting, makes sense to go for the better shooter, which would probably be Zeke Mayo. And that would be my favorite in that regard. But Shakeel Moore could make sense too, because I think Shakeel Moore and Dajuan Harris, for whatever minutes they're on the floor together, is going to be one of the best defensive backcourts in the country when they're on the court next to each other. And there is some real appeal to that. But this does feel more knocked down than it is Dajuan, Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, and Hunter Dickinson. If Zeke Mayo ends up being this unbelievable scorer, similar to what he was in his previous stops, but he transfers that over to the Power 5 level, it might be hard to leave that guy out of the starting 5. I do think there is that natural jump in competition, though, going from the Summit League to the Big 12. And I don't really have questions about Zeke Mayo having to make that jump from an offensive perspective, from a shooting the basketball perspective, maybe from a, consistently creating against more athletic, better defenders, but because he's on a Kansas team with all these other great players, he might not be drawing the number 1, number 2 perimeter defender on the other team each and every night. The bigger question there becomes, what is Zeke Mayo going to look like on the defensive side of the basketball court? And that kind of becomes the question of where he kind of fits into all of this. But yeah, starting 5, Harris, Griffen, Storr, Adams, and Dickinson. Let's get into the minute projections, who all I think can be a part of the rotation on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. First, we are brought to you by Game Time, an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch, which is super nice. I don't know about you, but baseball is one of those sports I like to get tickets just like the day of. It's like, yeah, we're in a mood. Let's go see a game. You maybe text a couple friends like, yeah, you want to go see a game, and maybe throw back a few pints and have a couple hot dogs and have a great time. Obviously, the Royals killing it right now. It's fun to see Bobby Witt Jr. and Seth Lugo and Cole Reagans. Ton of awesome things to go see. And they have killer last-minute deals with Game Time, so you can decide the day of. All-in prices, views from your seat, their lowest price guaranteed. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. They have plenty more than MLB, too. Comedy, theater, any other sports that are going on, right? You want to go to a soccer game right now. They have their zone deals where you can save even more when you choose a section, and just let Game Time choose the seat for you. If you don't really care, section's good. Doesn't matter where the seat is. So check that out. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, continuing on Locked On Jayhawks, and thank you to every dayers tuning in to each and every episode of the show. We will be joined by Nick Schwerdt later this week, and we'll have a Big 12 Media Days takeaway episode later this week too. So we're getting into the rotation projection for KU. So if you remember, we go back to last week, and thank you to everydayers if you did tune into this one, where we had the conversation about how deep does Bill Self typically go into his rotation. We showed you the chart that had each and every year how deep he went, and obviously it depended. Did you view it by total minutes, games played, minutes per game? Depended on the regular season versus the NCAA tournament? There were different ways to look at it, but basically we came to the conclusion that there were some years that he maybe did go even 10 deep, just kind of touching it. But for the most part, it was 7 to 8 deep, but there even were some other years where it was 9 deep. And something we talked about last week too is it's easy to every offseason hype up the idea that each and every one of these players that I like, that you watched their high school mixtape or you saw what they did at the previous stop from the transfer portal. You liked their game, and then they ended up happening to enter the transfer portal and come to Kansas. And, you get under the idea that each and every one of these players is going to be the fullest version of themselves that you're expecting them to. And that just doesn't happen, And so, you think back, I always think back 2 years ago, you bring in Grady Dick and MJ Rice, 2 McDonald's All-American wings. One doesn't play for you. One ends up killing it and becoming a first-round draft pick, right? And so it almost is a little bit of a dart throw there. The point being is, like, on paper, I like all these players Gabe has. I like Shakeel Moore. I like Zeke Mayo. I like Rakease Passmore. I like Flory Bidunga and Clemence and, all these guys. Chances are not all of them are going to hit at once. So it's easy to be like, oh, they're 10 deep, they're 11 deep. Well, what happens if, this player's just not ready, or this player's just not a good defender, and you end up being closer to 7 deep? So that could absolutely happen, and I remain open to that. For now, I'm projecting a 9-man rotation, and I have a 10th man getting spot minutes. Usually it's like, if it's an 8-man rotation, 9th man's getting spot minutes. So that's kind of how I have this working here. So as far as the minutes go, like I said, Dajuan Harris, Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson. Those are the starting 5. I think Zeke Mayo, Shakeel Moore, Flory Bidunga, all part of the rotation. Now, if you wanted to swap in Zach Clemence, you think he's going to beat out Flory Bidunga for the backup 5 minutes, I'm totally I'd be very amenable to that, I guess would be the way of putting it. And then I have Rakease Passmore as the 9th guy, who heard a lot of good things about how that's kind of translating over. But I have Dajuan playing all of his minutes at the point guard spot, giving you 32 minutes per game at the point guard spot. And I think this is an interesting one with Dajuan, because we heard last year on Bill Self, I think it was during a Hawk Talk, it might have been during a press conference, and he kind of talked about how Dajuan was best served being like I think he said 28 to 30 minute per game player. Maybe it was 28 to 32 minute per game player. Most often, guys that come back to school end up averaging more minutes per game for Kansas and under Bill Self. And that's been the case for Dajuan his entire career. He went from 16 minutes per game to 29 minutes per game to 34.2 to 35.7. So this would be a bit of a step back, but we have seen it before. And I think because Dajuan is at his best when he, this is what I think basically Bill Self was saying when he was saying he's best at 28 to 30 or 32 minutes per game, is the idea that he has more energy to be that pest defender, which is when he makes his biggest impact, because he's not a dynamic scorer. So he has to be a good distributor and a good defender. And last year, he wasn't the same defender. I think he was still overall a good defender for you, but the year before he was Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. And I think there was a difference there. And I think that's the hope you get back to this year. So honestly, I have Dajuan at 32. You could convince me it's going to be 30, but after Marco Jackson went down, and that was one possible less ball handler for you, I bumped this back up to 32. Rylan Griffen, I have playing 28 minutes. I think he gets some of those at the 2. I think he gets some of those at the 3. Pretty self-explanatory there. Maybe he gets a few minutes here or there at the 4. I don't know. AJ Storr, I have him getting 30 minutes. And honestly, with Griffen, you could convince me that's going to be north of 28, that's going to be 30, 32, because if his three-point shooting carries over and you really need that. With AJ Storr, same thing. If we're talking, what I said here is I have this out as a 9-man rotation. A very real chance that Bill Self just says, no, screw this. We're going with a 7-man rotation, and an 8th guy's getting spot minutes, or 8-man rotation and 9th guy's getting spot minutes. And then you get a few extra minutes for Rylan Griffen. You get a few extra minutes for AJ Storr. We see Bill Self do that all the time. But I think Storr plays the 3 for you. I think he plays the 4 for you. There's not a ton of options for KU to play the 4. Realistically, it's okay. You have KJ. AJ Storr can play there. Storr hasn't been a great rebounder, though, so that'll be the big question here. Griffen could play there, but, he's a little more slight. That's not the most ideal thing in the world. I mean, you could play 2 big basketball with either Flory or Zach. Zach makes more sense from the offensive perspective to play that way. Flory makes more sense to play that way from the defensive perspective, but I don't think either one is super great. But I think because of that, it does make Storr play a good amount of 4 minutes that does leave open more minutes for kind of the rest of the rotation at that point guard, shooting guard, and small forward spots. And then I have KJ playing 27 minutes. And this is another one where, honestly, the KJ Adams minutes is the biggest mystery in the world to me. I have him starting, and I feel good that he's going to be a starter at this point in time, as I kind of talked about earlier. I don't have a great idea of where his minutes are going to be. He averaged 27.3 minutes per game in his second year. He averaged 33.4 minutes per game a season ago. Now, last year's team obviously wasn't very deep, and they had even less options to play the 4 if you really kind of think about it there. Also, you go back to the minute per game total 2 years ago. If you were using that as the floor, that was him playing the center. So this is again very different. You could convince me KJ is playing 22 minutes per game. You could convince me he's still going to play 30, 32 just because Bill Self trusts him, and he tends to play those guys a lot. So honestly, the 27, that's the one that I feel like is the biggest guess. With Dajuan, you could convince me it's within 2 minutes. It's 30 to 34, right? With Rylan Griffen, you could convince me it's 26 to 30 or 32 or something. With AJ Storr, between 28 and 32. I think all of those will be relatively close. The KJ one, I don't know. I think it's a very wide range. And then you have Hunter Dickinson in there too, who I have at 28 minutes, all of those playing at the 5, same way I have all of KJ's minutes coming at the 4. again, this is one for Hunter that I think was probably conservative, that you look at Hunter, he's somebody who could play 32 minutes a night for KU and Bill Self. But I think in the same vein of what Bill Self said about Dajuan Harris, I think makes a lot of sense with Hunter Dickinson. If he's only playing 28 minutes per night as opposed to 32, and I know it doesn't sound like that big of a difference. Like, these are 22-year-olds. There's 4 extra minutes. And I don't know, it might. Like, every extra minute kind of counts, like where you're not exerting yourself, or that one extra break you can have in the game means that next 5 minutes you go out there is extra exertion. And to try to help on the defensive end of the court there, which is kind of the big question for KU playing Hunter Dickinson at the 5, I think it helps a ton if he is more energetic and has that. And over the course of the season, right, if you're playing, let's say 40 games, let's say you kind of play your max there, 4 extra minutes per game, the difference playing 28 to 32 minutes per game, that's 160 minutes, which that is the difference of like 5 extra games that you put on your body. So it does add up a little bit there if you're talking over the course of the entire season. But again, that's one that you could convince me it's going to be a few more minutes. I went with 28 under the idea that Flory Bidunga was going to be ready to go, or that it leaves a little bit of open minutes for spot minutes that we gave to Zach Clemence. Obviously, with El Marco, medical red shirt. I gave Jamari McDowell a regular red shirt. Maybe that doesn't end up happening since you really only have the 11 scholarship guys. And so with Jamari McDowell, if you redshirted, you would only have 10. So maybe that doesn't end up happening. Then again, maybe the fact that you added Noah Shelby, who isn't a scholarship player, but was a scholarship player at past colleges, like maybe that makes you more amenable to do it. And then as far as the backup spots, we're going Zeke Mayo, getting a few minutes at the backup point guard spot, and then getting minutes at the backup too. I think what will end up happening, I have it listed on here that Zeke Mayo and Shakeel Moore each get backup point guard minutes. I don't think that'll end up happening. I think what will realistically end up happening is one of those two, Zeke Mayo or Shakeel Moore, one of the two gets all of the backup point guard minutes and then plays some 2 minutes. And then the other one just plays 2 minutes, right? So I kind of just hedged the bet there, but I think the minutes still could end up, reasonably similar. So we'll see who wins the backup point guard. I think Zeke Mayo has better assist numbers throughout his career, but maybe because of his shooting, it makes more sense to just play him as a 2-man. I don't know. Honestly, it doesn't matter that much. Both probably would bring the ball up the floor, but I have Zeke playing 21 minutes per game. That's one where I also if you're talking bench players, that's probably the one where it has the biggest question mark for me. If Zeke is struggling on the defensive side of the ball, so Nick Timberlake still ended up playing a good amount of minutes per game. He obviously ended up starting during the NCAA tournament because of the Kevin McCullough injury. But if KU would have been deeper last season, let's say Arterio Morris didn't have all the off the court stuff happen, and he would have ended up being the player Bill Self wanted him to be and was probably playing 25, 30 minutes a night. That minutes had to come somewhere. It's probably shaving minutes off A, El Marco, and B, Nick Timberlake because of the defense, right? And so what happens if Shakeel Moore is really good and then you're playing AJ Storr and Rylan Griffen a ton of minutes, like the Zeke Mayo? What if he did get trimmed down to 12 to 15 minutes if Bill Self doesn't totally trust his defense? But then again, what if Zeke Mayo's offense and his 3-point scoring and his creation is so good that he could also play 26 minutes per night or something like that? That wouldn't surprise me either. So we went with 21 there. Shakeel Moore, I mentioned before, wouldn't be surprised if he played that kind of Roderick Stewart role, where Roderick Stewart was giving you I think it was 11 to 12 minutes per game for the national title team as kind of another athletic guard that you could throw out there. Now, when I made that comment, I don't think I had fully gone into the rotation possibilities for Kansas, because after the El Marco Jackson injury, and obviously Shakeel ended up joining after El Marco's injury, but there's just not as many ball handlers as I thought on the team, right? It's Dajuan, Zeke, and Shakeel Moore in terms of true ball handlers. So again, with Shaquille's defense, that's the interesting part here. I think in a vacuum, Zeke Mayo, better player than Shakeel Moore, but what does Bill Self trust? He trusts defense, and he loves athleticism too. I think Shakeel Moore is the more athletic player. I think Shakeel Moore is the better defender. Is there a case that Zeke Mayo and Shakeel Moore's minutes swap here? I think that could happen. But it all just depends on how the offseason competition goes. I'm still going Zeke Mayo ahead of him because I'm a big Zeke Mayo fan and everything, but I guess I would leave that open to interpretation and possibility. So I have Shakeel Moore playing 13, and then I have Rakease Passmore playing about 8 minutes on the wing. Again, you can convince me that's going to be 10 to 12. I definitely think Rakease Passmore is going to show a lot of good highlights and ceiling and everything. It's just hard to play a ton of minutes when you look at KU giving a ton of wing minutes to Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, and KJ Adams there. And then Flory Bidunga, I have him playing the backup center minutes. You could convince me that's just going to be all 12 if we had Hunter playing 28, but I just used 8 for Flory. Maybe that's closer to 10. And then that left about 4 spot minutes per game, which over the course of a season, as we talked about earlier, that's 160 minutes. So it might not necessarily be 4 minutes per game. It could be you play 8 minutes this game and then you don't play the next game, right? It could be you play 12 minutes this game and then you don't play the next 2 games, right? It's just kind of how that stuff works out. I like to leave a little bit of room for spot minutes because there just always are spot minutes over the course of a season. All right, let's finish up here with the biggest competitions and what could be some of the biggest, I guess, wrenches that could be thrown into this and what could possibly change some of the rotation numbers on Locked On Jayhawks. Finishing things up here with Locked On Jayhawks, what are some of the biggest changes, competition changes, that could most affect that projected rotation for me? And we will have another projected rotation before the season starts once we get, I guess, more intel or whatever's happening, whether it's late night in the fog or, some of the boot camp stuff and others that are going on during the preseason for KU. I definitely think one thing to keep an eye, like, it feels like to me there's a couple strings pulling on each other. Okay, and Rakease Passmore, Zeke Mayo, and Shakeel Moore. I know Passmore's more of a wing, and Zeke Mayo maybe more of a, I guess Zeke and Moore are both kind of combo guards, but it feels like to me that competition is going to be very interesting. Again, it isn't necessarily that you play the same position, but if you think about it, all of them could be asked to do similar things, which is like space the floor a little bit. I don't know. Maybe it's more reserved for Zeke that he's more of the spacer and the other guys are trying to be athletes and good defenders. But like when you're a role player, which is what they're going to be asked to do, because the star players for KU, the go-to options are going to be Hunter Dickinson and AJ Storr and Rylan Griffen and, Dajuan Harris is going to be setting people up and stuff. And KJ will just kind of fill in another way. But the go-to options, if you're Zeke Mayo on the floor, you might be the 4th option on the floor. If you're Rakease Passmore, you might be the 5th option on the floor. Right, whatever it ends up being. And again, maybe it's different with Zeke because he's so good on offense. But point being, you have to play a certain role. And so that just comes down to who wins out those competitions among those players. And so what if Rakease Passmore is just by far the best of them? Right? I think that affects the minutes of those other 2 guys. Same with Zeke Mayo or Shakeel Moore. I think there's a bit of a tugging between all 3 of those players, and that just adjusts to how you want to play. If Rakease ends up being the best player, you play more wings. Right? If it's Zeke Mayo, you're playing more 2-guard lineups. If it's Shakeel Moore, you're playing more 2-guard lineups. So I think that competition there, you almost view it as, okay, I had 21 minutes for Zeke Mayo, I had 13 for Shakeel Moore, I had 8 for Rakease Passmore. That's 42 minutes total, right, for the 3. Maybe if you want to call it 45, just to kind of round up a little bit. 45 minutes between the 3 of them combined. How does that get sorted out in the competition? Then what about Zach Clemence versus Flory Bidunga? Obviously, that is a real competition, but I think more so than that, does Zach Clemence play minutes at the 4? And I'm not just talking like spot minutes here or there. Does that become a real rotation thing for KU? Because if he is playing minutes at the 4, it changes the rotation, I think, a little bit to where you can get Zach, maybe double-digit minutes per game. If he beats out Flory Bidunga for the backup center minutes and you want to play him, a handful of minutes per game at the 4, right? Maybe he could get 15 minutes per game. So that becomes interesting in how Bill Self wants to utilize Zach Clemence. Is he only a 5 or is he a 4? And I think the last one here is what happens if KU is just much better with like AJ Storr playing the 4? And that's something we talked about earlier in the starting lineup question. How does that affect the way Bill Self wants to play? How does that affect the minutes? Does KJ's minutes go down? Does Storr's minutes go up? All that sort of stuff. How does that affect it? And I guess the flip to that is what if the KJ Adams minutes are the best minutes on the floor for KU? Then does it restrict AJ Storr playing less minutes at the 4? Now he's playing more minutes at the 3. Now Rylan Griffen's playing more minutes at the 2. Now there's less minutes on those guys, Shakeel Moore and Zeke Mayo. So I think those are kind of the biggest questions and competitions to look forward to through the rest of the offseason for KU. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. Make sure you're subscribed. And we have a few teams left. We're mostly filled up, but if you're interested in going to this trivia event, which is coming up on Sunday, July 21st, so 2 weeks from yesterday, that's happening at Johnny's in West Lawrence. A couple teams still left to register for a KU basketball trivia event at Johnny's West. So come on out to that and hit me up. It's on my Twitter at DJohnsonRadio where you can find out info more on that. All right, see you next time with Locked On Jayhawks.